All right. So when we talk about sourcing, the acronym that we're going to use is HAPPY, like I just said. And when we look at this, there's a nice little website here that I am going to link later on. I'm going to throw the link up whenever I post the video. I'll throw it on here, but it's just from Fiveable. It's an article written about it, but it's a good little way to think about it. So when we look at documents and we're looking at actual sourcing, the first thing that we're going to want to analyze is the historical context of this document. Now, all of these things are going to be questions to ask about whoever the author might be or whatever the reason or purpose of this article or quote or book or note or whatever it is, right? So the first thing, historical context. So what are the immediate historical events occurring at the time of this document that led to its creation, right? So if it's a document from a cardinal in England over to the Pope, well, it matters if that article is, or it matters if that letter is being written in the 1200s during the Crusades, or the 1400s when there's really not as much going on with all of it, or the 1700s when religion is very much being spread throughout the world and is in a very different place than it is in the 1200s, right? So, what are the historical events that are occurring at the time that led to this document being created, right? The next one underneath it says, what is the situation or the environment of ideas or emotions that led to the creation of this document, right? So if you're looking at a letter from somebody in the, you know, the early to mid 1700s, and it references all kinds of things like, um, enlightenment ideas and things like that, you can talk about that and say, like, the reason why this document was written is because all of these enlightenment thinkers were spreading ideas of independence and self-governance and not relying on a mother colony, or anything like that. I mean, you're just looking at how it connects with other things that are going on in the world, right? So that's the historical context aspect. So saying, this document was written because of other things going on in the world around it, right? Um, Next A, so in our HAPPY acronym, we've got the audience. This is the one that I think is going to be probably the easiest point to get when it comes to sourcing for a lot of things. So, um, for certain aspects of it all, this is where it's going to kind of matter, right? So, who is this document's intended audience? And how could the audience affect the attitude, content, style, et cetera, of the document, and why is that important, right? So this is kind of how I've been breaking it down. This is what I think is the most logical and easiest way to source documents. And so if you've noticed, I've talked a lot whenever it comes to different like memos and things where it's like, oh, this is from a government official. So it's using very formal language, trying to warn, someone of that kind of aspect and things like that. And more importantly, why is this audience important, right? So if you're writing to the king, it matters on how your tone is, right? You're not going to write a letter to the king in the 1500s and say, hey, bad stuff's happening here. Sucks, right? Like, they're not going to write that. They're going to say, my liege, there are ever so many problems with the natives. And they're going to be more formal and other things. And so how does that actually, matter? Why is that something that actually applies here, right? So audience definitely is an important aspect that usually is easier to break down than some of the other ones. The next one, point of view. So who is the author of the document / where does it come from? This is extremely difficult if the author is not a well-known person, right? So if the author is just some random guy or girl, I got nothing for you there, right? So how could this shape their opinion or emotions as expressed in the document? So how does their point of view change things, right? So one of the ways that I addressed this in the last DBQ you guys did was, for the scholarly article of the lady that was of Mexican descent. Well, that's her ancestors, right? That shapes her opinion on it. She's trying to educate the rest of the people about her past, right? So her point of view matters, right? It changes kind of the way that things are going to be put up across and the way that things are going to come across on her end. This next one is something you need to be very careful about because a lot of people think that bias is bad. It's not. Every single document and every single person is biased in some way, shape, or form to one thing or another. It's not bad, but what matters here is why that bias could exist, right? So it says determine possible bias and why that bias could exist. Every single document ever made is biased in one way or another. It's important then to note why is it that that document is biased in that way, right? So not how is it biased, but why is it biased, right? So if I was writing a document all about the Florida State football program, I'm going to talk about how much it is in shambles and how terrible it is. But someone who doesn't know anything about me would then go, oh, man, that must be true. Well, no, I have an implicit bias in here, right? Because, well, yeah. So like, obviously I feel differently than someone who is more neutral or even someone who is a Florida State fan, right? Because if they write the same exact document that I do, it's going to come across extremely different, right? So it's not a matter of figuring out why or if there is a bias, but why that bias could exist, right? So why is it that this document is biased in certain ways? Not just is it biased, but why? And this is an extremely difficult one that a lot of teachers and readers and graders that grade all these tests really hate. There are some teachers that, for whatever reason, the moment that you say that something is biased, they basically go, oh, well, obviously they have no idea what they're talking about, and just basically wave it off with a magic wand. I'm not saying that's the right thing or even a bad thing sometimes, but just know that this is going to be a tricky one. So try to stay away from it unless that's really the only move that you have left, right? The next part, identify any influence on the author and how that may have shaped this document. That part really matters, right? So if it's someone talking about a war and they happen to have been in the war, that matters, right? So if it's someone who is a prisoner of war, or if they're on the winning side or the losing side, both of those things can influence the way in which that document comes across, right? So point of view is going to require you to know about the author themselves, right? So you have to know what he or she has been through, is going through, or did in their life to really get this part kind of across here, right? The next one, purpose. This is another one that I think is rather easy in terms of getting the point across without ever knowing who the author is. Because for point of view, you really have to know who the author is in order to get that. In historical context, you need to know all the background events that are going on during the time period. But purpose, you can interpret, right? So when it comes to the purpose, so why is this document created is kind of a big deal, right? So why did this, person go through with making this? And the last DBQ that you guys did, for example, there's the one where the Dominican monk is basically writing back to the Pope in England saying, or I'm sorry, not England, in Europe, saying, oh my God, the Spanish are being so terrible and everything else. So what reason does he have for making that, right? So why is that the case? So for the sourcing part for that one, if you remember, I said something along the lines of, he's trying to show that the Spanish are being extremely greedy and violent and awful. And for whatever reason, you can interpret that throughout it. But my interpretation was that it was essentially soiling Christianity, right? So Christianity was being spread all over the world at that time period. And he was saying, the Spanish are using Christianity for the wrong reasons, right? The next one here. So what was the author trying to achieve by creating the document? Are they trying to sway the public? Are they trying to sway the king? Are they trying to convince one of the people on the other end to essentially come over to their line of thinking, or are they just trying to inform people, right? Are they just trying to get the information out there, right? So, what was the author trying to achieve by creating this document? And then the last one for happy, and I know it starts with a W, but why literally is the letter. So why? So how does this document affect or support, discredit, shape, reflect popular arguments on the subject? That's hard. That is extremely difficult because you have to know what the popular arguments of the current historians are of that subject. Extremely difficult unless you have the background information, right? How does this document reflect continuity or change over time? If all of your essay is talking about that, you can kind of source documents by showing, hey, look how this is a differing view that is taken on by people, right? So the way in which Europeans viewed the Native American population in the 1700s is very different than they view them in, let's say, the 1970s, right? So how did the continuity or change over time affect what the author was saying, right? That could be something that you could look at. But that one's a little bit, again, more reliant on you knowing the background information as you're talking about it. What are the limitations of the document? This is difficult as well. Knowing that this document doesn't have enough of something, right? So maybe the document talks all about how, great and amazing NASA is, but doesn't reference the Russian space program in any way, shape, or form, right? So maybe like that kind of is something that could be a limitation, or it's just something that because of who the author is, you're not going to get as much information from the document. This is a very difficult one that is a much higher order of thinking. So that's going to be a little bit more complex. And then why is the document significant? This is an easy one if it is a popular document. So if it is a quote from something that you've seen before, like let's say one of the documents that they decide to use is like from the Constitution of the United States, and it's an excerpt from that. You can talk about why the Constitution is important, right? Why, the Magna Carta is important, or any sort of like major well-known document, or if it's from a super well-known author. That's also something that can work pretty well for here. So when it comes to like who wrote the documents, if it's someone super famous in history, if it is someone whose name has lasted, hundreds of years into the past, then you can talk about why that is significant. So like, why is this document significant in the broader aspect of things? So that's an easier one if it's a famous document, right? It's hard if it's just a random, journal from a random trading post from the 1500s. Like, oh, that's not that, right? But if it's a special or significant document, you can definitely talk about why it's important there. Then it says, quick tip, source as many documents as you can, time permitting, but at least one extra just to be safe. In this case, you can get 2 points for sourcing. You can try for 3. That's what I would do. If you're going to try to use 4 documents, there's probably going to be one that you're going to go, I have no idea any of the sourcing aspects of any of this. Well, then cool. Just leave it alone. Ignore it. Move on. If you can try to source 3, that's amazing. If you can do 2, that's great. If you can only do 1, that's okay too. All of those are essentially points that you can get that are almost like bonus points. And I mean that because realistically, if you can get the contextualization, you get background information, if you can get a thesis, and then if you can get all 5 of the evidence points, you're already at 7 points. If you can get sourcing thrown in there, that allows you a little bit of wiggle room to mess up on 1 or 2 of the evidence points and still end up getting a 4 or a 5, I think, when all said and done. So that's just kind of a quick overview on sourcing. Again, I'm going to link this into everything and kind of throw it down there. But it really is just it's an easy point to get once you have the skills that are required to do it, right? So being able to break all this down a lot of times requires that background information, which is why we're doing these unit reviews, so that way you have that background information right at your hands right then and there, right? So that's sourcing, and that's the big thing that I wanted to share with you guys. As for the rest of kind of things for this week, you will notice, if you haven't already, I posted an assignment that we were given, I'm going to say a directive to do. And it is essentially a makeup assignment for the third quarter. So third quarter grades have been submitted, done everything else before this. And the superintendent sent out a message that basically said, hey, because there are no final exams, there's not really a way to do better if you're on the bubble between two grades. So in other words, if you have a B and like from third quarter, and if you end up getting a C, for example, in the fourth quarter, you'll still get a B, right? But if you had an A last quarter, and for whatever reason, e-learning is really killing you, and you are going to get a C this quarter, right? They kind of look at that and go, well, if you had an actual final exam, you could have taken it, gotten an A on that, and then still gotten an A. So that's not really fair for whatever purpose, reason, logic you can have, whatever. So they rolled out a thing and they said, okay, well, the bigger reason is that if you got an F in any quarter and then you got even a D in the next quarter, you automatically fail the semester now because there's no exam. And they didn't really think that was fair. So originally they were like, well, we're going to put this out there so that way kids that got an F last quarter can get their grade up to a D, and kids that got a D can get their grade up to a C. And I looked at that and went, I hate it. I don't think it's fair to target the lowest population and give them a chance to boost all of their grade without allowing everyone to. So instead, I'm making it optional for everyone. I think that it's only fair to put this out there for everybody, so everyone has the option. Now, in the post, I kind of half messed up because I made the same post for all of my classes, but you should let this be known here. This is a personal thing. So it is totally optional. You do not have to do it, but it is personal. It asks you to reflect, and it asks you kind of how this is going for you with e-learning, essentially, is one of the paragraphs. In the actual document, which I'll pull up here in a second, it's going to ask you to do essentially a comparison between the 1918/1919 like flu pandemic that hit the United States and the rest of the world. So it's going to ask you essentially at the beginning part to use the two documents essentially in a DBQ way, as well as any outside research to talk about how the Spanish flu influenced life in 1918, right? Then for your second paragraph, it's going to essentially ask you to look at what is currently happening. So with COVID-19 here, it says use what you have seen / heard on the news in the last month or two to compare and or contrast the Spanish flu outbreak with the COVID-19 outbreak of 2020. This paragraph is where you're going to write about how life during an outbreak is similar yet different 100 years apart, right? So what has been different about this outbreak compared to the last one? And then the third paragraph, and this is where you have some options. But essentially all of them are personal options here. So it says, like, what is, in your opinion, or what's your opinion of the quarantine efforts that are taking place in the United States? Do you think it is enough? As well as essentially how has rationing affected lives during this? Kind of talk about how you notice it's changing the way it's perceived on TV, and or like has your family been able to acquire the necessities and the stay-at-home orders and stuff like that. And then the third one, what do you miss slash not miss about school? Think about your transition to online education and reflect on the changes that you've had to adapt to in the last month, right? So it is an assignment that requires a little bit of reflection about all of it. But if you complete it and you submit it and everything else, it will lift up your third quarter grade one letter grade. Now, if you already have an A last quarter, I got nothing for you. There's really nothing I can give you to boost your grade because I mean, you already have an A. So if you had an A last quarter, just don't worry about this assignment. Just kind of shrug it off. But it is optional, and you do have a good amount of time here, right? So it's due May 15th. So this is not something you have to stress over and do right this second. I certainly would want you to focus on the DBQ first. Get that done. And then at the end of the week, the Unit 3 and 4 review is posted and is due on Sunday. And with that, I'm going to end the recording, and we're pretty much done for the day. So if you have anything else that you have questions about, please feel free to send me any questions that you have. Otherwise, I will see most of you during your one-on-one time at some point during this week where we can talk more about things individually.